I hope you remember the Archaeplastids. They're the limb on the eukaryote tree of life that took in a cyanobacterial endosymbiont to become the original eukaryotic phototroph, cell with chloroplast. Some members of this eukaryotic clade eventually became the endosymbiont plastids for other eukaryotes, specifically a red alga becoming the plastid for the SAR organisms and a green alga becoming the plastid for euglenids. The plant kingdom also emerges from this limb, and what I want to do is to cover the basic organization within the Archaeplastida, just enough to give you a feel for who the plant's closest relatives are. The Archaeplastid most recent common ancestor, as we visualize it, was a photosynthetic eukaryote with a cyanobacterial-derived plastid. Now, there may have been a lot of similar eukaryotes, including some dating to before or after this one particular species. But what makes this organism the most recent common ancestor is that it was the one splitting into the two basally divergent lineages of Archaeplastids, one staying more or less green and the other turning red. This red lineage, the Rhodophyta, or red algae, are reddish in appearance because they absorb more in the blue area of the spectrum. The shorter blue wavelengths penetrate deeper into the water relative to longer wavelengths, and hence the standard logic is that these algae adapted to the deeper water habitats by having pigments absorbing more in the blue and less in the red. Green pigments, by contrast, tend to absorb strongly in the longer wavelengths of red and orange. That said, red algae that you find today are not only found in deep water. The crusty red algae, known as crustose corallines, are among the most common things you find in some tide pools. And not all red algae are even that red. The seaweed used for nori wraps of sushi rolls is porphyra, which is a red alga. The green lineage, sometimes referred to as green plants or viridi plantae, which is the Latin equivalent for green plants, includes the bulk of the Archaeplastids, most notably the green algae and land plants. The most recent common ancestor shared by green plants splits into two lineages, the Chlorophyta, or true green algae, and the Steptophyta, of which land plants comprise the bulk. The chlorophytes are 100% aquatic, and they've always been aquatic. They never transitioned onto dryland habitats. The official definition of the plant kingdom, Kingdom Plantae, refers only to that part of the Steptophyta that became terrestrial. All members of the Plantae descend from the original plant that first crawled up out of the water and took on a primarily terrestrial existence during the late part of the Ordovician, about 450 million years ago. Basal, non-land plant streptophytes still exist. The text refers to this group as the Charophyta or Charophyta, though it's probably more accurate to recognize a grade of basal streptophytes. These aquatic sisters to the land plants includes a species that I encounter a lot. In my pond/pool, I sometimes have to clear out filamentous algae. The two common types are Cladophora, which is a chlorophyte, and Spirogyra, or water silk, which is in the Zygnometales and part of the basal non-plant Streptophyta. It's really easy to tell them apart. If it feels soft and silky, it's Spirogyra. And if it's kind of rough and stringy, then it's Cladophora. When I made this video, I was hoping to show you Spirogyra, but the stuff I pulled up was rough to the touch, and therefore it's really the green alga Cladophora. But based on what you're seeing here, I might as well tell you that it's silky Spirogyra. The point I want to make is that the non-land plant streptophytes are green and aquatic, but not chlorophytes. They're not true green algae because they don't descend from the most recent common ancestor shared by all members of the Chlorophyta. Now here's a good question for you. Why don't we just back up a bit further, redefining the Chlorophyta based on an earlier ancestor that shared with the streptophytes like Spirogyra? Wouldn't this make it easier to classify the green algae as anything living in water, including both the things that we call chlorophytes together with the non-plant streptophytes? So no, this would not work at all. If you actually did this, then that common ancestor, the one uniting streptophytes with chlorophytes, would also be an ancestor of land plants. Remember that Spirogyra is really more closely related to a redwood tree than it is to a green alga like Cladophora. The chlorophyta in the accepted cladogram is defined by a common ancestor that's more recent than the common ancestor it shares with streptophytes. It may be inconvenient, but we just have to accept that there are some aquatic green things, like Spirogyra, that are neither plant nor chlorophyte. So here it is one more time. You'll want to note the nested structure of clades within clades. Archaeplastida is the most inclusive with two subclades, the Rhodophyta and the Viridiplantae. Viridiplantae, also known as green plants, splits into the Chlorophyta and Steptophyta. Steptophyta has one or more basal splits before it gives way to the land plants, which is where the next part of our story begins. In the next lecture, we generate a narrative for understanding the very first invasion of dry land by plants. This was a turning point in the history of life, and it transpired in the first half of the Paleozoic.